Hi everyone, and welcome to Truth Over News. Something very unusual has happened. Kevin McCarthy, the new Speaker of the House, has given Fox News' Tucker Carlson exclusive access to thousands of hours of Capitol surveillance footage from January 6th. According to reporting from Axios, Carlson's TV producers were on Capitol Hill last week to begin digging through the trove, which includes multiple camera angles from all over Capitol grounds. Excerpts will begin airing in the coming weeks. To make matters even more interesting, it turns out that there are actually 41,000 hours of footage from that fateful day, as opposed to the 14,000 hours of footage that has been repeatedly referenced in court documents, and the even lesser 7,000 hours that Biden's DOJ has repeatedly claimed is actually relevant to January 6th. Much needed answers may finally be forthcoming. As we all know, there have been a myriad of questions surrounding the events of January 6th, a day when mostly peaceful and nonviolent Americans gathered to protest what many, including ourselves, viewed as a fraudulent election. An election that saw an unprecedented amount of mail-in ballots, literally tens, if not hundreds of millions distributed. An election that saw unconstitutional changes to our state election laws. An election that saw a chain of custody issues for hundreds of thousands of mail-in ballots that far exceeded the margin of victory for Biden in key contested states. An election that saw Biden's margin suddenly increase in the days after Election Day. The questions of who began the rioting on January 6 and who helped it to gain momentum remain very much unanswered, although we're seeing increasing evidence of undercover officers embedded in the crowds, in many cases appearing to egg the demonstrators on towards the Capitol. We have direct evidence that undercover Metropolitan Police Department officers were chanting "Our House" and repeatedly urging protesters to advance up the northwest steps of the Capitol on January 6th. Also very curious are events such as the one where MPD bike police stopped a group of armed suspects who were heading from the Ellipse area where Trump gave his speech towards the Capitol during President Trump's speech on January 6th. The suspects claimed that they are police and then produced what appeared to be DOJ DEA agency credentials, although the resolution is poor and not definitive.
Hey, how you guys doing? Quick question. Give me a second. Just doing a little investigation. Asking this respectfully, is anyone armed? Anyone
Yes,
armed?
we're all armed. Police.
Police?
Yeah.
Law enforcement.
Yeah.
Can you show me your credentials? Okay. Appreciate it. Appreciate it. That's all I need. You got to do a little bit better at hiding that.
We also have reporting from Joe Hanneman that details a conversation between beleaguered MPD officers who stated their belief that they were set up to fail by their superiors. As Hanneman details, the body cam of MPD officer Lawrence Lazewski shows Lazewski and another MPD officer expressing the belief that police had been set up on January 6. "They set us the blank up," the officer said. "That's what they did. They set us up. They set up Unit 64. "Absolutely," Lazewski responded. The first officer continues, "And then they ask you all to come 2 hours later. They set us up." Lazewski replied, "They needed everybody right away." There are many, many other examples like these, and now, hopefully many more will be forthcoming.
They set us up, that's what they did. They set us up. They set up 64.
Oh, absolutely.
And then they asked y'all to come 2 hours later. They set us up.
They needed everybody right away.
Nah, right away. They set us up. So now we ain't got.
Meanwhile, the political clown show known as the January 6th Committee has refused to show these videos. But that hasn't stopped them from using the events of that day to demonize an entire segment of Americans as domestic terrorists, using selective video clips in the process to make their case. At the same time, the January 6th committee has used every legal trick possible to keep the larger trove of videos hidden from the public, even as video clips have been selectively presented in court as evidence against hundreds of January 6 defendants. Nor was it just the January 6th committee who helped shield the surveillance videos from the public's eye. Biden's DOJ designated all surveillance video as highly sensitive government material back in March 2021, subject to strict protective orders. As Julie Kelly noted, even defendants and their lawyers were having a tough time accessing the footage. It's also worth pointing out that the vast majority of video footage that was made public came from public sources, not from the heavily restricted Capitol Police surveillance video footage that Tucker now has access to. Which raises a very real question. With tens of thousands of hours of previously restricted video footage being released, how will those current cases, along with the conclusions from the January 6th committee, hold up to intense scrutiny? Our guess? Not good. But will it make a difference in those cases, given the intense bias exhibited by the DC judges? The answer to that question is unfortunately much less clear. Although we're extremely happy that the video footage has been released to Tucker and his producers by McCarthy, who in actuality was forced by Matt Gaetz to do so. And we're hopeful that Tucker and his team will do a good job of getting the information out to the public. We're also curious why only Tucker was chosen to receive the 41,000 hours of video footage. Surely the sheer number of man-hours required just to review the almost overwhelming amount of video footage would make crowdsourcing a more viable way to proceed. And of course, there are many others that have also focused intensely on the events of January 6th. People like Julie Kelly of American Greatness and Epic's Joshua Philippe, who produced an in-depth 1 hour and 42-minute documentary on events of that day.
The story of January 6 changes drastically, depending on who's telling it. The House Select Committee on January 6 has deemed the incident an attack on the American system, comparable to the bombing of Pearl Harbor or even the terrorist attacks on 9/11. It's being investigated as a potential insurrection that could allegedly incriminate former President Donald Trump. And it's being used domestically to frame a new narrative on domestic extremism. America needs answers on why the main instigators are not charged, who made the calls on security that day, and why.
The answer to how there's suddenly 41,000 hours of footage rather than the previously known 14,000 hours may partly reside in an affidavit filed in March 2021 by Thomas DiBiase, the Capitol Police Department's general counsel. DiBiase stated that the Capitol building and its grounds are monitored 24/7 by an extensive system of cameras positioned both inside and outside the building. The system captured more than 14,000 hours of footage between noon and 8 p.m. on January 6th. That footage was made available to 2 Democratic-controlled congressional committees, the FBI, and the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. But after a request by Congress, the agency handed over to Congress footage from the entire 24-hour period, likely explaining the 41,000 hours that Tucker received. There's also a lesser-known element to this story. Although President Donald Trump has received blame for events on January 6th, the role of his Vice President Mike Pence in the period leading up to the Capitol breach has remained largely undiscussed. 2 days prior to the events at the Capitol, during an impassioned speech on Monday, January 4th, Pence reassured the enthusiastic crowd that he stands with President Donald Trump. Pence continued, telling the cheering crowd, "We've all got our doubts about the last election. I want to assure you, I share the concerns of millions of Americans about voting irregularities. And I promise you, come this Wednesday, we'll have our day in Congress. We'll hear the objections. We'll hear the evidence."
You know, I know we all got our doubts about the last election. And I want to assure you, I share the concerns of millions of Americans about voting irregularities. And I promise you, come this Wednesday, we'll have our day in Congress. We'll hear the objections. We'll hear the evidence.
On the morning of January 5th, Trump sent a tweet stating that the vice president has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors. That afternoon, the New York Times ran a story alleging that Pence had told Trump at lunch that day that he did not believe he had the power to block congressional certification of Biden's victory. That evening, Trump issued a statement claiming Pence had never said that. Trump continued, declaring, "The vice president and I are in total agreement that the vice president has the power to act." Neither Pence nor his office made any statement refuting the president's claim or restating Pence's position until the following day, when Trump was nearly finished giving his Capitol speech, which began at noon on that fateful day on January 6th. At 12:53, Pence's office released a letter to members of Congress stating his position for the first time publicly, saying, "I do not believe that the founders of our country intended to invest the vice president with unilateral authority to decide which electoral vote should be counted." In the letter, Pence also claimed his adherence to the Electoral Count Act, a controversial and likely unconstitutional provision that violates the Electors Clause and the 12th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Pence's position that he did not have unilateral authority to decide which electoral votes should be counted was not a totally unreasonable position in and of itself. But Pence's failure to clarify his position until Trump was near the end of his speech on January 6th was an issue. To make matters potentially more inflammatory, Pence also sent his statement out broadly in a tweet at 1:02 Eastern Standard Time, exactly 10 minutes before Trump wrapped up his speech before a huge crowd of tens of thousands of people. As previously noted, Pence's statement was first released to Congress at 12:53 p.m. 4 minutes later, individuals began jumping fencing located at First Street, and at 12:58 p.m., a crowd broke through fencing near the Peace Monument. At 1:02 p.m., fencing on the Capitol steps was breached. It was at this exact moment that Pence's statement, this time via a tweet, was sent again. At 1:06 p.m., the joint session of Congress convened to count the electoral votes. At 1:12 p.m., Trump finished his speech at the ellipse. The situation at the Capitol continued to rapidly deteriorate, and at 2:08, the Capitol was placed on lockdown. Between 2:11 and 2:18 p.m., the Capitol building was breached, and at 2:18 p.m., the House called a recess during its debates over objections to the electoral votes from Arizona. At 2:26 p.m., the Senate called a recess over an objection to the electoral votes from Arizona. At 2:38, President Trump sent out a tweet calling for peace in the Capitol, asking that everyone please support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. They are truly on the side of our country. Stay peaceful. By roughly 5 p.m., relative order was restored in the Capitol, allowing the Senate to resume its proceedings at 8:06 p.m., and at 3:42 a.m. on January 7th, Pence certified the election results. Pence declared Biden the president-elect with no further objections to the election results being heard. Following the certification of votes, Pence shared an elbow bump with Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. Notably, Pence later said nothing in defense of conservative congressmen such as Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley when they were being demonized in the media for raising constitutional objections to the electoral votes, something that Democrats have done 3 times in the last 2 decades. Let's hope that Tucker and his team are thorough in their analysis and share their findings and videos broadly. Let's also hope that these 41,000 hours of video are ultimately shared with a much larger body of researchers.